So this week we're going to talk about the relationship between science and religion. This is an enormous topic. There's no way I could possibly cover even a tenth of what's been written or thought about this. So we're just going to take a little taste of this using the trial of Galileo as a kind of case study. So the readings are about both the general relationship between science and religion and the trial of Galileo. The first part of the readings goes through a number of ways of talking about the relationship, and that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. In the second video, I'll talk more specifically about the trial of Galileo, so that's more corresponding to the second half of the readings. For now, let's just lay out some of the basic ideas in the first half of the reading, talking about different ways of conceptualizing the relationship between science and religion. Okay, so the reading is by Gregory Dawes. Gregory Dawes goes through a bunch of different, what he calls typologies of the relationship between science and religion, different ways in which science and religion could be related. So there's several different schemes like this. This one by Barbour is pretty famous. It's pretty central. It's come under a lot of criticism, so there's a big debate about what the right categories to use are and how to use those categories. But this one's a classic. I think it's a nice place to start getting into this discussion about science and religion. And if you're interested in this, you can follow up on the further developments and refinements of this picture. So let's start in on Barbour's typology of possible ways in which science and religion could be related. And I'll just go through these one at a time, explain how they're supposed to work, give you an example, that kind of thing. Okay, so we'll start with conflict. Like I say, sometimes Google image search really comes through. Okay, so one way, of course, that religion and science could interact is in terms of conflict. They're fighting each other over who's correct, who should be able to sort of determine what people think, and that kind of thing. So I think this is if you ask the average person what the relationship between science and religion is, they are likely to come up with some version of the conflict thesis. I think the conflict between science and religion has been really hyped up over the years. But according to Dawes, amongst professional historians of science, the idea that science and religion are generally speaking in conflict has actually become somewhat unpopular. There's a lot of points in history, and I think we've seen a few of them already, where science and religion got along just fine. And in fact, if you go back far enough, I think there's not a clear distinction between the two. They might be different parts of the same overall activity. So the general thesis that science and religion are always fighting is very unpopular. At the same time, I think it's very hard to deny that there have been points at which science and religion are fighting over who's correct, they're fighting over people's right to say what they think, and that kind of thing. So the conflict thesis has a long history in the history of science. The readings go through a couple of versions of this, a couple of fairly strong versions of what they call the conflict thesis. That's the general idea that science and religion are overall in a fight. And the readings go through White and Draper's versions of the conflict thesis, the idea that there's a kind of systematic fight between science and religion throughout history. So, but even these two, who are held up as examples of the early classic conflict thesis people, don't say that religion is always in conflict with science. So Draper, for instance, argues that some religions are more likely to have fights with science than others. He's a Protestant, and he thinks that Catholicism is a particular offender for being at odds with science. So he thought that the kind of dogmatism of Catholicism, that is, that they have a really clear set of beliefs that they defend vigorously. So they have a dogma, a religious dogma. He thinks that aspect of Catholicism makes it particularly likely to put it in conflict with science. That's an apt example to keep in mind because it's the Catholic Church that Galileo is going to be having a fight with in the other video. So White didn't think that all religion is anti-science either, but was a vocal critic of dogmatic religious authorities trying to hold back scientific progress. So neither of these thinkers say that all religion is in conflict with all science all the time. That's a version of this thesis that's too extreme for, as far as I know, anybody in the literature to have defended. There's much, even the classics of the conflict thesis don't hold it as a universal thesis. And in fact, I think this is a good place to sort of warn you about a way of treating these typologies that isn't going to work in general. So Ian Barbour, who comes up with this fourfold typology that we're going through right now, complains in later publications that people are misunderstanding what he's saying with these. So when we talk about these four ways in which science and religion can relate, what he wants us to avoid is what he calls essentialism. So he wants us to avoid the idea that there's just an essence of science and an essence of religion, and those two essences can be in some kind of universal relationship with each other. So like science is all about this and religion is all about that, and they're always going to be in conflict because that's just what they are. So treating science and religion as having kind of unchanging universal characteristics is really just to ignore the complexities and diversity of religions and science. Those are both very broad categories with very different examples within them. So Barbour himself argues that it's just too simple to say that all the relationship between religion and science falls under one of these categories all the time. So here's a quote. He says, "Some critics hold that all typologies are too simple and too static to illuminate the complex and changing historical interactions of science and religion. I argue that typologies serve a useful pedagogical function even though every particular interaction must be seen in its historical context." Okay, so the guy who came up with this typology isn't saying we should just sort of decide which of these four every interaction between science and religion falls under. He's saying, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. You have to ask which religion and maybe which part of that religion is interacting with which science and maybe which part of that science, and when and where and who's involved. So you have to get down to the particulars if you're going to characterize the relationship between science and religion in any given case. Okay, so we're not looking for, is science always in a fight with religion? We're looking to categorize a particular interaction between the two. Just as a metaphor for this way of thinking about these typologies, imagine trying to characterize the relationship between all nation states. Are all countries at war with all other countries? No. Are they all friends with each other? No. Sometimes they're friends and sometimes they're fighting. So it would be hilariously irresponsible and overly simplistic to try to say all countries are either fighting each other all the time or not fighting each other all the time. Similarly, I would say it's way too simple to try to say all religion is fighting science all the time or all religion is getting along with science all the time. It's just much more complicated and detailed than that. And you're really a lot better off taking it on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so back to our typology. I mean, if you want an example of conflict, it's hard to think of a better one than the Galileo affair. So we'll cover that in some detail in the next video. And this is Dawes's example that he develops throughout the rest of the book of serious conflict between science and religion. Okay, so back to the typology, conflict. Let's do independence now. So here's a way in which science and religion could relate to each other. This is a picture of famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who suggests that religion and science cover what he calls non-overlapping magisteria. So a magisterium is an old Catholic term, I think, for an area of authority or teaching. So if your magisterium is like the area that you cover. And what he's saying is science and religion essentially cover different areas. So they don't conflict because they're not talking about the same thing. Okay? So Gould puts it like this. The net of science covers the empirical universe, what it is made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. Okay. So he's saying that the meaning of life is the job of religion, and the structure and composition of the world is the job of science, and that those are two jobs that don't overlap. So you don't have to fight because you're doing different work. So, I mean, keeping in mind that we shouldn't succumb to the temptation to characterize all science and religion interaction under any of these, I think a charitable way of interpreting Gould here is saying that this is a generally true thing rather than true in every case. So it tends to be the case that religion covers meaning and science covers facts. There are certainly instances where religious sort of bodies of knowledge make claims about the world. Some scientists have made claims about knowing how morality works, so it's not the case that there's never been overlap on these, but if we're reading Gould charitably, maybe he's saying there tends not to be overlap. So he's aware that there are some conflicts of facts, because in the very same article, in the article that I'm quoting from here, he mentions the fact that evangelical Christians have denied the theory of evolution. They think that humans were created in our current form some fairly short time ago. So he's pretty aware that there are religious groups who are making factual claims that conflict with the factual claims of science. He knows this. So either he's speaking in a general way, allowing for exceptions, or maybe he's speaking in a, let's say, how things should be sort of way. So he's saying everybody would be happier if science stuck to the facts and religion stuck to the meaning. It's unclear. As a universal claim, it's just obviously not the case that these things never overlap in their claims, but there are a couple of reasonable ways we could read him that do make some sense. Okay. So a nice example of independence would be the study of human evolution. Again, it's certainly not the case that every religion has no opinion on human evolution, but the Catholic Church, to go back to our example, says the following. They say, look, we accept whatever scientists tell us about the origins of human beings. So the official stance of the Catholic Church right now is to accept that humans evolved via natural selection over a really long time period. And what they say is that natural selection doesn't tell us when the soul entered the human body. So at some point in the process of evolution, God planted our immortal souls in us, and that's not something that shows up in the fossil record. So the Catholic Church does not deny the facts of evolution. They just say that there are additional spiritual facts that are not covered by evolution. So this is a nice example of trying to separate out the sort of roles of science and religion. Okay. There's a third way that science and religion can interact: dialogue. So this is stronger than independence. It's not just that you've got your job and I've got mine and we'll stay out of each other's ways. This is science and religion actually interacting and talking to each other. So ideas are actively being exchanged between the two groups, hopefully for the betterment of both. So they remain independent in the sense that we're not trying to collapse science and religion into each other so that they're just one big activity, but there is a kind of interaction and dialogue between the two. A nice example of this from fairly recently is the interaction between Buddhism and neuroscience. So over the last couple of decades, there's been some really interesting research going on where highly skilled Buddhist meditators are undergoing brain scans while they're meditating, and there's been some quite interesting results on sort of what's going on in their brains while they're doing this. Now, Buddhists have a bunch of, different kinds of Buddhism have different models, but the various Buddhisms have various quite complex and sophisticated models of what's going on in the mind when they're doing the various practices. Neuroscientists have been listening to them, learning about their models, and then applying their own models to the brain scans that they do. So the hypotheses of the Buddhists are being used to, in some way, shape the research program. But this isn't a case of the Buddhists are now, oh, I'm just going to believe in neuroscience rather than, for example, in the structure of karma and rebirth that's typical in the Buddhist models of the mind. So Buddhism isn't being replaced by neuroscience. Neuroscience isn't being replaced by Buddhism. But there's an active conversation between the two where ideas are being exchanged and their ideas on both sides are being developed. Okay. And finally, we go one step further to full-on integration. So here, science and religion kind of become the same activity. So a nice example of this is actually from the history of Christianity. So here's Robert Boyle saying, the two great books of nature and scripture have the same author, so the latter does not hinder at all an inquisitive man's delight in the study of the former. So this picture of two books we've got in the Christian religion, there's the Bible, and then there's nature. And for many scientists in the history of sort of the European tradition, Christianity was seen as licensing studying nature as a kind of religious activity itself. So studying nature was a way of learning about the mind of God because, of course, they believed that nature was created by God. So in this case, being a scientist and being a religious person are not even separate activities. You're doing religious work by doing science. And I think a number of people thought of it this way. Obviously, Robert Boyle, Newton comes to mind as somebody who had this kind of way of thinking about his practice. So I think there's a bunch of cases where people just don't see science and religion as separate activities. Is this always the case? By no means. There are lots and lots of cases where integration isn't the way things are happening, but it is one possible way that they can interact. Okay. So that was a very brief tour of Ian Barbour's typology of ways in which science and religion can interact. In the other video for this week, I'll be looking at one specific case study, and it's the trial of Galileo. I mean, it's hard for me to read this in any way except as a conflict. Although when we get into the details, even calling it just very clearly and obviously a conflict is a little sketchy. So it can be the case that even one person interacting with one specific religious body, maybe it's not so clear where to place it in this typology. But it's most people think that it's more on the conflict side than anything.